Good evening. 20 December 2015. We're on the verge of the winter solstice, I hear. We continue tonight in the chapter on Brahman, Purusha, Ishvara, Maya, Prakriti, Shakti. Sri Aurobindo has been describing the dynamism that inheres in conscious being, which is expressing itself universally and individually in the universe in all the variety of possible becomings. But yet, this conscious being remains transcendent and outside of all, even as it invests itself minutely and majestically in all that exists in the cosmos. He has noted in the close of the previous paragraph that we ended with, but the Brahman is at the same time omnipresent in all relativities. It is the absolute, independent of all relatives, the absolute, basing all relatives, the absolute, governing, pervading, constituting all relatives. There is nothing that is not the omnipresent reality. In observing the triple aspect and the triple power, we come to see how this is possible and how to phrase it philosophically, which is what the life divine is. A reading to the mind of what the spirit has scanned in its experience of the supreme reality, which Sri Aurobindo has found everywhere. It is not simply above and beyond the universe, outside of time, beyond space, whatever that might mean to the mind, but it is intimately present. It is the very stuff of our own nature. Yes, our physical nature, but also our soul nature. How do we make all of this part of a single view? How do we integrate this in a perspective that includes all? Sri Aurobindo continues with his argument. If we look at this picture of the self-existence and its works as a unitary, unlimited whole of vision, it stands together and imposes itself by its convincing totality. But to the analysis of the logical intellect, it offers an abundance of difficulties, such as all attempts to erect a logical system out of a perception of an illimitable existence must necessarily create. For any such endeavor must either affect consistency by an arbitrary sectioning of the complex truth of things, or else, by its comprehensiveness, become logically untenable. And you can apply that dictum to each philosophy that you encounter in the history of the world's thought, and you find that his statement is amply substantiated. He began with a reference to self-existence, Swayambhu, a term that means the self-existent, which, of course, is at the foundation of Vedanta. We find the term first in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, but we also see it significantly expressed in the Katha Upanishad and figures in the Isha Upanishad, which, as you know, is of central importance to Sri Aurobindo's study. The idea that the divine exists from its own power. Nothing causes it to exist. It always is. This is what eternity means. This is what eternal being is. But whatever that is, if it enters into the universe, how do we reconcile? Because pouring itself into even a universal figuration means a limitation of its eternity in time, means a limitation of itself captured in space. And all sorts of antinomies come flooding into the manifestation by dint of its willingness to enter into it. So, he says, for we see that the indeterminable determines itself as infinite and finite. The immutable admits a constant mutability and endless differences. The one becomes an innumerable multitude. The impersonal creates or supports personality, is itself a person. The self has a nature and is yet other than its nature. Being turns into becoming, and yet it is always itself and other than its becomings. The universal individualizes itself, and the individual universalizes himself. Brahman is at once void of qualities and capable of infinite qualities, the Lord and doer of works, yet a non-doer and a silent witness of the workings of nature. So this all-surpassing reality, as it enters manifestation, is full of contradictions. He continues, if we look carefully at these workings of nature, once we put aside the veil of familiarity and our unthinking acquiescence in the process of things as natural, because so they always happen, we discover that all she does, in whole or in parts, is a miracle, an act of some incomprehensible magic. The she here, of course, is Maya, that power of conscious being to convert the unlimited into the limited. Going back again to the Shvetashvatara Upanishad, which Sri Aurobindo has cited for us at the beginning of this chapter, 4.10. The being of the self-existence and the world that has appeared in it are, each of them and both together, a supra-rational mystery. Now, if rational refers to the reason of humanity, to the mind, the supra-rational is that which is above the mind. And so something that is akin to, native to, the divine consciousness. So self-existence expresses itself through a supra-rational power which is a mystery to us. There seems to us to be a reason in things because the processes of the physical finite are consistent to our view and their law determinable. But this reason in things, when closely examined, seems to stumble at every moment against the irrational or infrarational and the suprarational. The consistency, the determinability of process seems to lessen rather than increase as we pass from matter to life and from life to mentality. If the finite consents to some extent to look as if it were rational, the infinitesimal refuses to be bound by the same laws, and the infinite is unseizable. So again, some terms here. The irrational, something which is outside the reason. The infrarational, what is below the reason or mind. And the suprarational, what is above or beyond it. So we spent a lot of time talking about how the indeterminate can determine itself and yet maintain its freedom and indeterminacy in the beyond. So if we have what seems to be a focus on physical laws that govern nature, and we can define what they are, well, when we look more deeply into, for instance, quantum reality, we find that the same logic that applies at the level of our physical experience seems not to apply there. Sri Aurobindo is already at this point reading about the higher thought of physics, understanding what Einstein and Heisenberg and other people have said. So he's not unfamiliar with these arguments. So the infinitesimal refuses to be bound by the same laws as govern the macro-universe. And the infinite is unseizable. The infinite is not the universe. We can't equate it with universality only. The infinite may become the universe, but the infinite is also what is beyond the universe. We should not equate the two terms. The infinite literally has no boundary. The universe may have boundaries. And though it's immense, beyond calculability to the mind, to the true infinite, it is a small part of itself, a fractional aspect of its being put into manifestation, part of its potency, not the whole of it. So he continues now, as for the action of the universe and its significance, it escapes us altogether. If self, God, or spirit there be, his dealings with the world and us are incomprehensible, offer no clue that we can follow. God and nature and even ourselves move in a mysterious way which is only partially and at points intelligible, but as a whole escapes our comprehension. All the works of Maya look like the production of a supra-rational magical power which arranges things according to its wisdom or its fantasy, but a wisdom which is not ours and a fantasy which baffles our imagination. Simply beyond our ken. The spirit that manifests things, or manifests itself in them so obscurely, looks to our reason like a magician and his power, or Maya, a creative magic. But magic can create illusions, or it can create astounding realities. And we find it difficult to decide which of these suprarational processes faces us in this universe. So here again, spirit is pictured as Maya. They are not separate. Maya is a functioning of spiritual awareness and power. But our difficulty is that we can't determine whether we're facing one thing or the other. When we look at it, we see only this mysterious suprarationality whose play is unfathomable to us. But in fact, the cause of this impression must necessarily be sought not in anything illusory or fantastic in the supreme or the universal self-existence, but in our own inability to seize the supreme clue to its manifold existence or discover the secret plan and pattern of its action. It's our incapacity, which is the flaw. The self-existent is the infinite, and its way of being and of action must be the way of the infinite. But our consciousness is limited, our reason built upon things finite. It is irrational to suppose that a finite consciousness and reason can be a measure of the infinite. This smallness cannot judge that immensity. This poverty, bound to a limited use of its scanning means, cannot conceive the opulent management of those riches. An ignorant half-knowledge cannot follow the motions of an all-knowledge. So this is our situation. Our finite consciousness cannot understand the infinite without widening, without deepening, without becoming one with that infinite. Our reasoning, he says, is based upon our experience of the finite operations of physical nature, on an incomplete observation and uncertain understanding of something that acts within limits. It has organized on that basis certain conceptions which it seeks to make general and universal. And whatever contradicts or departs from these conceptions, it regards as irrational, false, or inexplicable. But there are different orders of the reality, and the conceptions, measures, standards suitable to one need not be applicable to another order. So, for instance, the superrational is not governed by material law, so we cannot take that category of predictable phenomena and say, so must the superrational behave. He continues, our physical being is built first upon an aggregate of infinitesimals, electrons, atoms, molecules, cells. But the law of action of these infinitesimals does not explain all the physical workings even of the human body. Much less can they cover all the law and process of action of man's supraphysical parts, his life movements and mind movements and soul movements. So how can subatomic associations directly govern biological processes? It cannot. And so we go into the higher orders of being. Supra-physical means whatever is above the body, right? And in Sri Aurobindo's experience, and is in the way that he has depicted the universe to us, matter bases universal manifestation, but above it is a plane of life. Above that, a plane of mind. Above that, a linking world of light, of vastness, which he calls the supermind, which draws the riches of Satchit Ananda and pours them through itself into manifestation. Over-mentalized, no doubt, but still, through the supermind comes the infinite into manifestation. And yet, it has, in a sense, been involved into matter, so is not wholly absent from it, but as we evolve out of matter, we first experience that, begin to understand it rationally with our minds, and see the universe in terms of what the mental interpretation is of this vast, experienceable reality. But we experience it only partially. And if we try to present or project our mentalized experience of the universe upon what is beyond the frame of physicality, we err. It is a fundamental mistake. It is a badge of ignorance. In the body, Sri Aurobindo writes, finites have been formed with their own habits, properties, characteristic ways of action. The body itself is a finite which is not a mere aggregate of these smaller finites which it uses as parts, organs, constituent instruments of its operations. It has developed a being and has a general law which surpasses its dependence upon these elements or constituents. In other words, it's not simply the sum total of whatever you count, whether it's subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, however it is that you're pouring these things into a unity, and you say, ha, finally, I can put the equal sign, this is what it is. No, because this is a being that has an inherent capacity to be a world of itself. Each being is an inherent microcosmic order. It exists. The life and mind, again, are supraphysical finites with a different and more subtle mode of operation of their own, and no dependence on the physical parts for instrumentation can annul their intrinsic character. There is something more and other in our vital and mental being and vital and mental forces than the functioning of a physical body. So here again we come to address the higher parts of ourself, which are not equatable to physical sensations, the physical mind's activities, but which indeed impress themselves upon that physical and vital equipment. But again, each finite is in its reality, or has behind it, an infinite which has built and supports and directs the finite it has made as its self-figure. so that even the being and law and process of the finite cannot be totally understood without a knowledge of that which is occult within or behind it. Our finite knowledge, conceptions, standards may be valid within their limits, but they are incomplete and relative. A law founded upon an observation of what is divided in space and time cannot be confidently applied to the being and action of the indivisible. Not only can it not be applied to the spaceless and timeless infinite, but it cannot be applied even to a time infinite or a space infinite. An interesting sentence, because those of you who have studied Einstein know that he had invoked the much disputed cosmological principle to say that in any part of the universe, the order and the laws that obtain exist in all other parts of the cosmos necessarily. We shall see. A law and process binding for our superficial being need not be binding on what is occult within us. Again, our intellect, founding itself on reason, finds it difficult to deal with what is infrarational. Life is infrarational, and we find that our intellectual reason applying itself to life is constantly forcing upon it a control, a measure, an artificial Procrustean rule that either succeeds in killing or petrifying life, or constrains it into rigid forms and conventions that lame and imprison its capacity, or ends by a bungle, a revolt of life, a decay or disruption of the systems and superstructures built upon it by our intelligence. So to say, when the mind erects ethical standards, social customs, and say, this shall stand for all eternity, one abuts the other, begins frictional assault upon the other, a fight emerges, a war emerges, there is no peace. There is no one intellectual standard that can govern anything about life. Life is always changing forms and direction. It is evolving and growing, and throws off the intended control of the mind. Pardon me. He continues, an instinct, an intuition is needed, which the intellect has not at its command, and does not always listen to when it comes in of itself to help the mental working. And that is the common experience. We find that an intuition visits us. We might even be aware of it. We say, no, my common sense, my ordinary experience tells me that I should not listen to this. Let me set that aside. And that illumination fades into the background, and finding itself unwelcome may not visit again soon. And yet it does try to come, and we could adhere to its suggestion and thereby enter into a world of greater knowledge. But still more difficult must it be for our reason to understand and deal with the suprarational. The suprarational is the realm of the spirit, and in the largeness, subtlety, profundity, complexity of its movement, the reason is lost. Here, intuition and inner experience alone are the guide, or if there is any other, it is that of which intuition is only a sharp edge, an intense projected ray. The final enlightenment must come from the suprarational truth consciousness, from a supramental vision and knowledge. So again, here Sri Aurobindo is suggesting to us that intuition, when it comes and wishes to express itself and to suggest its greater vision of reality to our mind, it comes as a projected ray of truth. Not the entire sun, not the orb of the sun coming to visit, but a ray from that sun. And what it strikes upon is lit up with its luminosity. We should learn to be receptive and awake to it. If we do that by practice, it comes more and more fully, and the light and the power grow. And it comes no longer simply as a ray, or isn't even as a collection of beams, but as a complete flooding of light, universalizing the mind, giving it a more comprehensive view. And so in our inner and personal practice, and forgive me for this divagation, we must attend to this. We must become aware of that bridging intuition which we can reach in our personal sadhana. But the being and action of the infinite must not be therefore regarded as if it were a magic void of all reason. There is, on the contrary, a greater reason in all the operations of the infinite, but it is not a mental or intellectual, it is a spiritual and supramental reason. There is a logic in it because there are relations and connections infallibly seen and executed. What is magic to our finite reason is the logic of the infinite. We've met this phrase before, a couple of pages back. We'll meet it again. This is a signature of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, because it invites us to go beyond philosophy, beyond the ratiocination of the mind, and arrive at a true and comprehensive vision of the whole, which then can lean back into the mind and express fulsomely what it sees. The mind tries to piece things together, to form parts into a whole. But this logic of the infinite knows already the many tessellations which bring the warp and the woof of the world together. It is, he writes, a greater reason, a greater logic, because it is more vast, subtle, complex in its operations. It comprehends all the data which our observation fails to seize. It deduces from them results which neither our deduction nor induction can anticipate, because our conclusions and inferences have a meager foundation and are fallible and brittle. If we observe a happening, we judge and explain it from the result and from a glimpse of its most external constituents, circumstances or causes. But each happening is the outcome of a complex nexus of forces which we do not and cannot observe, because all forces are to us invisible. But they are not invisible to the spiritual vision of the infinite. Some of them are actualities working to produce or occasion a new actuality. Some are possibles that are near to the pre-existent actuals and, in a way, included in their aggregate. But there can intervene, always, new possibilities that suddenly become dynamic potentials and add themselves to the nexus. And behind all are imperatives, or an imperative, which these possibilities are laboring to actualize. So the restricted view of the mind is exceeded in a glance of the infinite. The supra-rational sight is inner as well as outer. It is not sense-bound. It is not deductive. It is a direct vision. When we see an occurrence in time and space, There are actualities present, surely. There are potentialities. There are imperatives. And all of these lean together, work in a sublime chemistry to arrive at a result. If we try to judge only from the actualities, from the surfaces of things, it is no wonder that our knowledge is so limping, so ignorant, because we're working from a fraction of what is really operative in the universe. We see a glimpse and we think we see the whole. He continues his argument. Moreover, out of the same nexus of forces, different results are possible. What will come out of them is determined by a sanction, which was no doubt waiting and ready all the time, but seems to come in rapidly to intervene and alter everything. A decisive divine imperative. It's important to understand imperative. Imperare, to command. An imperative is something expressing a command. You note that it's associated with the term imperial. So this again is suggestive that there is a divine will, imperious in its conduct, which insists that this result obtained now because I say so. Even if it is super-rational and defies the logic of the finite, it makes perfect sense in the logic of the infinite. All this, he says, our reason cannot grasp, because it is the instrument of an ignorance with a very limited vision and a small stock of accumulated and not always very certain or reliable knowledge, and because, too, it has no means of direct awareness, for this is the difference between intuition and intellect. That intuition is born of a direct awareness, while intellect is an indirect action of a knowledge which constructs itself with difficulty out of the unknown from signs and indications and gathered data. But what is not evident to our reason and senses is self-evident to the infinite consciousness. And if there is a will of the infinite, it must be a will that acts in this full knowledge and is the perfect, spontaneous result of a total self-evidence. Self-existence, self-evidence. It is neither a hampered evolutionary force bound by what it has evolved, nor an imaginative will acting in the void upon a free caprice. It is the truth of the infinite, affirming itself in the determinations of the finite. So this is the will of the infinite. It is evident that such a consciousness and will need not act in harmony with the conclusions of our limited reason, or according to a procedure familiar to it and approved of by our constructed notions, or in subjection to an ethical reason working for a limited and fragmentary good. It might and does admit things deemed by our reason irrational and unethical, because that was necessary for the final good, for the final and total good, and for the working out of a cosmic purpose. It does not defer to mental standards. It is beyond good and evil. What seems to us irrational or reprehensible in relation to a partial set of facts, motives, desiderata, might be perfectly rational and approvable in relation to a much vaster motive and totality of data and desiderata. Desiderata means what we earnestly long for. Reason, with its partial vision, sets up constructed conclusions, which it strives to turn into general rules of knowledge and action, and it compels into its rule by some mental device, or gets rid of what it does not, of what does not suit with it. An infinite consciousness, would have no such rules. It would have instead large intrinsic truths governing automatically conclusion and result, but adapting them differently and spontaneously to a different total of circumstances, so that by this pliability and free adaptation, it might seem to the narrower faculty to have no standards whatever. And so it is outside rationality. Often when we look at the suprarational, we call it the irrational. In the same way, we cannot judge of the principle and dynamic operation of infinite being by the standards of finite existence. What might be impossible for the one would be normal and self-evidently natural states and motives for the greater, freer reality. It is this that makes the difference between our fragmentary mind consciousness, constructing integers out of its fractions, and an essential and total consciousness, vision, and knowledge. It is not indeed possible, so long as we are compelled to use reason as our main support, for it to abdicate altogether in favor of an undeveloped or half-organized intuition. But it is imperative on us, in a consideration of the infinite and its being in action, to enforce on our reason an utmost plasticity and open it to an awareness of the larger states and possibilities of that which we are striving to consider. In other words, we have to continue with our reason, such as it is, as we grow and strive to move beyond it. Reason is still a better guide than nothing. To be rational is better than being infrarational. But we have to have this utmost plasticity, which he describes. In other words, we must be capable of being molded. That's what plasticity is. We have to be able to outgrow our current self, to exceed ourselves. He continues his argument. It will not do to apply our limited and limiting conclusions to that which is illimitable. If we concentrate only on one aspect and treat it as the whole, we illustrate the story of the blind men and the elephant. In other words, we become that. Each of the blind inquirers touched a different part and concluded that the whole animal was some object resembling the part of which he had had the touch. So if you touch the trunk, you think the elephant is the trunk. If you touch the tail, you think the elephant is the tail. If you touch the leg, the foot, you think that's the elephant. If you touch its massive chest, you think the elephant is the chest. But with your hand, which represents here the limited intellect, you cannot touch the whole of the elephant all at once. It eludes you in its entirety. And so the mind is like that. Let us not illustrate that image by becoming it. In other words, let us expand our consciousness. This idea of the elephant analogy, is something that is very old. There are Jain versions of this, or Jain versions if you prefer, Buddhist versions, Hindu versions, there are even Muslim stories that reflect the same tale. It's a universal truth and accepted by everybody. It's very enlivening to tell that. Ramakrishna used to tell wonderful stories about it. An experience of some one aspect of the infinite is valid in itself, but we cannot generalize from it that the infinite is that alone, nor would it be safe to view the rest of the infinite in terms of that aspect and exclude all other viewpoints of spiritual experience. The infinite is at once an essentiality, a boundless totality, and a multitude. All these have to be known in order to know truly the infinite. And this is just the infinite as seen in its essence and as pouring itself into manifestation. What it is in its indeterminability, of course, is beyond discussion. To see the parts alone and the totality not at all, or only as a sum of the parts, is a knowledge, but also at the same time an ignorance. Vide the Isha Upanishad. To see the totality alone and ignore the parts is also a knowledge, and at the same time an ignorance. For a part may be greater than the whole because it belongs to the transcendence. To see the essence alone, because it takes us back straight towards the transcendence and negate the totality and the parts, is a penultimate knowledge, but here too there is a capital ignorance. A whole knowledge must be there, and the reason must become plastic enough to look at all sides, all aspects, and seek through them for that in which they are one. We are back to the primary message of the Isha Upanishad. All this is the happenation of the divine. It is here. It is there. We can't ignore the manifestation. We can't ignore the essence. We can't concentrate on the essence and ignore the manifestation. We must include them both. We must integrate them. They are aspects of a single being. This is where we shall rest tonight on the eve of the winter solstice. We'll continue with our chapter next week. Mother observed that the winter solstice was important and figured itself in many of the world's spiritual traditions because it represents the return of light and has obvious significance for theistic religions and mystically based religions too. With that in mind, I think I would like to read tonight something from Savitri, which is in the Book of Beginnings, the first book, which speaks to this aspect of the return of light, of the dawn itself. A conscious frame was here, a self-born force. In this enigma of the dusk of God, this slow and strange, uneasy compromise of limiting nature with a limitless soul, where all must move between an ordered chance and an uncaring blind necessity, too high the fire spiritual dare not blaze. If once it met the intense original flame, an answering touch might shatter all measures made, and earth sink down with the weight of the infinite. A jail is this immense material world. Across each road stands armed a stone-eyed law. At every gate the huge dim sentinels pace. A gray tribunal of the ignorance, an inquisition of the priests of night, in judgment sit on the adventurer's soul, and the dual tables and the karmic norm restrain the Titan in us and the God. Pain with its lash, joy with its silver bribe, guard the wheel's circling immobility. A bond is put on the high-climbing mind, a seal on the too large, wide-open heart. Death stays the journeying discoverer, life. Thus is the throne of the inconscient safe, while the tardy coilings of the eons pass, and the animal browses in the sacred fence, and the gold hawk can cross the skies no more. But one stood up and lit the limitless flame. Arraigned by the dark power that hates all bliss, in the dire court where life must pay for joy, sentenced by the mechanic justicer to the afflicting penalty of man's hopes. Her head she bowed not to the stark decree, baring her helpless heart to destiny's stroke. So bows and must the mind-born will in man, obedient to the statutes fixed of old, admitting without appeal the nether gods. In her the superhuman cast its seed. Inapt to fold its mighty wings of dream, her spirit refused to hug the common soil, or, finding all life's golden meanings robbed, compound with earth struck from the starry list, or quench with black despair the God-given light. Accustomed to the eternal and the true, her being conscious of its divine founts, asked not from mortal frailty pain's relief, patched not with failure, bargain, or compromise. A work she had to do, a word to speak. Writing the unfinished story of her soul in thoughts and actions graved in nature's book, she accepted not to close the luminous page, cancel her commerce with eternity, or set a signature of weak assent to the brute balance of the world's exchange. A force in her that toiled since earth was made, accomplishing in life the great world plan, pursuing after death immortal aims, repugned to admit frustration's barren role, forfeit the meaning of her birth in time, obey the government of the casual fact, or yield her high destiny up to passing chance. In her own self she found her high recourse. She matched with the iron law her sovereign right. Her single will opposed the cosmic rule. To stay the wheels of doom, this greatness rose. At the unseen's knock upon her hidden gates, her strength, made greater by the lightning's touch, awoke from slumber in her heart's recess. It bore the stroke of that which kills and saves. Across the awful march no eye can see, barring its dreadful route no will can change. She faced the engines of the universe. A heart stood in the way of the driving wheels. Its giant workings paused in front of a mind. Its stark conventions met the flame of a soul. A magic leverage suddenly is caught that moves the veiled ineffable's timeless will. A prayer, a master act, a king idea can link man's strength to a transcendent force. Then miracle is made the common rule. One mighty deed can change the course of things. A lonely thought becomes omnipotent. Light be with you. Namaste. Jai Ma. And to all green, dear souls.